Welcome to Life List, a birding podcast.
Hello, everybody. This is George Armistead, and we are back with a fresh episode here of Life List, a birding podcast. I am with my co-host, Alvaro. How are you doing today, Alvaro?
Good. How you doing, George? Everything's really sunny and warm out here in California. Actually, like they say in the brochures, it's one of those days. It doesn't actually happen most of the time.
Sounds nice. Yeah, it started out pretty gloomy here, but has turned into a beautiful day. So I want to get to the good stuff here, guys. We have a special guest. Special guest. Our first interview on Life Lists.
Yikes.
Yeah,
this is new for us.
Very new, very scary. Hold on to your hats. Strap yourself in here. We are very pleased for our guest, who is a legend, I dare say. Very pleased today to have with us someone who's not only a good friend to both me and Alvaro, but also an incredibly gifted ornithologist. What does Dan Lane do, you might ask? Well, a little bit of everything. Originally from Drew, New Jersey, he migrated south to Louisiana, where he still remains, for the most part, working away on his East Baton Rouge parish list, at least when he is not traveling to beloved Peru. While Dan has led trips for Field Guides Incorporated the world over, he still spends most of his time abroad in the country nearest to his heart. Not only do the birds, the cuisine, its people, and of course all the roadside puppy dogs all tug at his heart, Dan is, as chance would have it, also the author of The Birds of Peru, as well as one of the book's primary artists. He is one of the greatest students and experts on the world of bird sounds, with thousands of recordings in the Macaulay Library and Xenocanto. Dan has discovered and or described multiple new species of birds, perhaps most famously the scarlet-banded barbet and the brand spanking new Inti Tanager. On top of all this, he is an abhorrent and shameless adorer of horrible and terrible puns, and I've only just learned as well that he does an incredible imitation of a French-Canadian world champion moose caller. Please welcome to the show, DFL, or as I like to call him, Dan frickin' Lane. Welcome, Dan.
Merci. Hey, y'all. Good to be here.
Yeah, man. Good to have you. And what is up with the moose call? Tom Johnson told me this. He was like, you got to hear Dan do his moose call imitation at some point. I don't know if today's the day, but
I don't think so.
You know,
I think that's for a different podcast and perhaps a whole different genre.
Wow.
I don't think we want to put our listeners through that, but
As a matter of fact, I'm starting a moose call podcast next week.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is that what was the other phrase that y'all have been talking about in previous shows?
The rock hound.
The rock hound. Yeah, moose callers and rock hounds. That's going to be your new podcast.
I did want to tell a little story about the first time, I believe, that I met Dan. I think I might have met at Cape May once or something, like briefly, but then like you, me, Chris Witt, maybe Matt Sharp, one or two others, we did the drive down to the Outer Banks from Philly to do some Christmas bird counts.
Yeah, with Ned, if I remember correctly. I think Ned was there.
Yeah, Ned would have definitely been there. Ned Brinkley would have definitely been there for some of those. He would have joined us probably from Norfolk on down. And I remember, I can't remember what was out on the beach. I mean, there was always a lot of gulls out at the tip of Hatteras.
Oh, yeah.
I recall there was some really soft sand. That was what was out on the beach.
Yes, that was the most memorable part of that.
And it was my car that we were using at the time. And I guess I hadn't learned how to play the clutch properly when driving in soft sand. I burned out my clutch.
Yeah, I was going to say, I believe that was the last drive for that vehicle.
No, it wasn't, but it required a tow, and I think I had to have a new clutch installed, and that was no small chunk of change for a grad student at the time. So, yeah. That was fun.
I remember like we were like, oh, we can do this. Yeah, it's no problem. You know, it's just people drive out here all the time. Let's go out here. There's some gulls. Maybe we'll find some longspurs. You know, and then it's like your vehicle's like stuck, and it was pretty close to like the tide line. Like there was water coming in because I think that was where the firm sand was. We were like trying to the firmer.
I don't
sand.
remember now.
Yeah. Well, I have a vision of
There was
of
probably like
looking.
15 people in one car. That was probably the problem too.
Yeah, probably wasn't used to
I
that
just have
weight
this
up
vision,
there.
and maybe I've created this vision in my head, but I have this vision of like we were like, all right, Dan, sorry we stuck your car, but there's birds to see. We got to go, and we're off in the dunes, like looking at longspurs or something.
That
And I look
that
back and I was
sounds
like, boy,
that
I
sounds
was like, I
about
think the
right. I
tide is.
recall being like, wow, they just left me here.
Yeah, I remember like I think the tide's coming in too. It looks like the tide's really kind of getting close to his car. There, well, I'm sure he'll be fine. Yeah.
And
I
people
don't
say,
remember anymore how we got out.
they always say that birders have tunnel vision. It's like, here's, friend in distress, guy you've just met, and you leave him there. It's like, well, there could be a longspur out here. So sorry, buddy.
That's right. You'll figure this out. We'll be back.
Yeah.
And then Al, like you and I, we've known each other since the early to mid 90s, but we hadn't actually met in person until like 2006.
Yeah.
Something like that.
We wrote a series of articles in birding on how to identify Catharis, the spotted thrushes, because we both came up on these really difficult to identify birds, and we were talking about it. We said, we should write an article, and Dan illustrated it, and we put together this set of articles, which amazingly, I think, to me, amazingly, is still sort of the only article out there on this subject. You think by this point, somebody else would have redrawn the map and, just sort of figured out a whole bunch of new stuff. But it's funny. Sometimes birding moves slowly,
And unfortunately, those articles are not really available to the online community the way I wish they were. It seems like there's a lot of folks who are posting, photographs of Catharis thrushes and saying, what is this? And I'm not really able to. I mean, I've got sort of these scanned PDF versions, but they're not really high quality. I don't know if you have anything better, but I wish that birding could somehow do that for us.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah, I know that those were great pieces. They were big at the time. I remember everybody was like, "Oh, this is next level." And I think I knew both of you guys at that point, but didn't realize that you guys didn't know each other. It's pretty funny.
Yeah. Well, I mean, like Val said, we communicated considerably through Bird Chat. I think it was, wasn't it? The listserv way back when, and
Bird Chat.
And that's how we kind of got in touch, and then we just started working on this. And it took us like 6 or 7 years to get the whole thing finished and published. And then it was another 6 years or something before we actually met at a Field Guides meeting, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's pretty fantastic.
But it was like we knew each other, but we just never had seen each other, kind of thing.
Right.
Had to get lifers. Had to get your lifers.
That's right.
Yeah, the in-person lifers. Mm-hmm. No, it's I've ever since then, I've been impressed at your level of sort of detail at which you look at things, and also some of when I first met you, some of the sound stuff you're doing. I felt like, oh man, I really need to up my game. This Dan Lane guy, he's really, he's listening to bird sounds here and learning all this stuff, and and I'm sitting there drinking beer.
Well, I listened to your last podcast that you posted a few days ago, and I have to agree with you on the night flight stuff. Like that is, I've tried really hard to learn night flight calls, and I think that there's a combination of like the lack of context, that you have, because you don't have a habitat that you can use to help you sort out what likely candidates there are.
It's the night sky, Dan.
It's the night sky, yeah. And then on top of that, it's like some of these things are so far away that the attenuation of the sounds just doesn't permit you to hear the sounds really clearly. So, I'm totally on board with you on that one.
If the sound in fall is moving north, it's a small bildilania. That's the
is that right?
key. Yeah, that's right.
Oh, I thought you were going to say, like, if it's moving north, then it's going to be slightly red
red
tinge. If it's moving south, it'll be blue tinge.
Yeah, they don't account for that, right? If it's a really fast bird, it's going to go like, where?
Yeah, the Doppler. That's right. That's why they use Doppler radar, right?
That's right. On that note,
that call note.
Nice. Nice. Important subjects here that we're seeing too. Good stuff. One of the main things actually we wanted to talk to you about, Dan, was the fact that you've discovered how many new species have you either discovered or been a part of describing? Where are you with that now? I know you were near in double digits, I think, last time I talked to you about this.
So,
yeah.
I think Dan might be one of the few people in the world who actually has to use multiple fingers to count how many species they've described. It's amazing.
I hate to say it, but you may not be that far off. Let me actually, I've got a list here. I could take a look.
So
it actually has crossed
more species, and most of us have had cars.
Yeah, exactly.
It looks like species. There's 2 subspecies that I think will not likely be splits, but I'm up to 10 new taxa at this point. Taxa being a species or subspecies, a nameable population. So I'm up to 10 with this most recent one, and I've got probably another 10 or so that I need to try to get done. So
wow,
yeah,
that many in the works. I figured you had a couple. I didn't realize it was that many.
Yeah, no, it's yeah. There's actually it's more. But many of those are also subspecies at best, I would say, or sort of arguably could be around the border. But kind of what drew me down here, right, to Louisiana, was when I was 12. My family had received a bunch of back issues of Audubon magazine, and I was reading through those, and there was an article. What caught my eye was this gorgeous painting of a little owl sitting by a sprig of orchid, in clearly a tropical setting. And so I read the article, and it was about this place called the LSU Museum of Natural Science, and particularly focusing on the work of 2 people in particular. One was John O'Neill and one's Ted Parker. And it talked about the fact that these folks and students who've been working with them had been describing and discovering these new species to science in Peru, in South America. And that kind of blew my mind at the time. And so I just sort of decided right then and there, well, that's what I need to do. I need to figure out how to get down there and try to be part of that program, because that just sounds like the coolest thing on earth, which, I think most people agree it is. And so I basically just sort of focused on what I would need to do to get into this program, studying Spanish and taking biology courses. And I even contacted Van Remsen, who is he just retired, but was the main professor, curator of birds at the museum. When I graduated from high school, I think I just called him up. I cold called him out of the blue and said, "Look, I'm really interested in this program. I was just wondering if there's any chance at all that I could join an expedition." And Van, you could kind of hear on the other end of the line, he was like, sight unseen, we don't normally accept people into this program on expeditions. We actually have we have enough students who are yeah, it was Van, and he's like, we actually have enough students who are all fighting for positions on these expeditions that I don't think we have any spare spots that we could just give to others. But, and he gave me advice on what I should do to try to angle to get into the program. Although I don't think Van remembers that conversation. I'm sure he probably got several people who did that. But I followed his advice and luckily was able to get into the program. And so that was really the main way that I got into LSU. And my purpose wasn't to get a degree at LSU, although, I got a master's degree in the process, but it was to get into the field and work with John. Ted at that point had already died. And, just by sheer dumb luck, my very first expedition in 1996, I was the person to spot the scarlet-banded barbet first, and that was a new species. So that was kind of the best and worst thing to have happened to a 20-year-old kid.
It's just a shame, Dan, that it wasn't a better-looking bird,
Nice. Hey, just to backtrack for, so the audience too, there's something really special about a brand new species that maybe some people get confused with a split, right? So let's say, in the future, we decide that marsh wren is two different species, one in the east, one in the west. They split, so we now have two species from one, but that is not a new species because there already is a name attached to one of those new forms. Right. So when we're talking that Dan's found new species, these are things that exist in the world that didn't have a name.
Right.
And
previously
not an
unknown.
English name, but a scientific name that they actually go into the scientific world with. This is something new that science didn't know. If we split something, we know those things. We just have reassessed them, kind of almost like like accounting. It's an accounting problem, but this is actually new. So just people are wondering, what's the big deal of new species? They happen all the time, right? No, but they don't happen all the time. Splits happen all the time.
That's a good observation. So, for example, there actually have been two new species described from the United States in the past, 40 years, which is kind of amazing in itself. Yes. And one, I think a lot of people, actually, I was just talking to a client on this last tour who didn't realize it was newly described, was the Gunnison sage grouse. This was a bird that people had been seeing, their hunters had been hunting. In fact, that's how it was basically discovered. The wildlife biologists who were receiving the information from the hunters about their bags, effectively, were discovering that there were these two size classes in sage grouse that were being hunted. And I don't know what it was that keyed them in, that it seemed to be geographic, that there was a certain population that had smaller birds always. And so I think that was how people first got aware of the fact that there was this different population of sage grouse, and it didn't have a name, right? People didn't even recognize it as different from the rest of sage grouse. And so this group of scientists from, I don't remember what university, I think it was in Utah, is that right? Basically started following up on this, and they I think the first thing they discovered after realizing there was different size classes was that, in fact, there were different plumage characters between at least the males of the two populations. And then eventually they started observing them doing their displays, and they discovered their displays were different. And so here you have this undescribed species of sage grouse. So that's a pretty huge thing, since I think the previous newly described bird from the United States was like 80 years earlier. I'm not entirely sure what it was, but it was something like, right around the turn of the last century. And then the second case is this Cassia crossbill, which has just been accepted by the AOU, or the AOS, I guess now. Although I guess there still are some people who are not entirely convinced of the case for that. But yeah, those were genuine newly named birds, which is basically what is meant when people say, a new discovery. And yeah, so a split would just be, splitting Audubons and myrtle warblers would be a split. And as you, right there, you have two names already. These birds were described 100-something years ago. And so that's a split, right? So you've got these two populations that are diverging, and they're a little bit different in their morphology and their calls and so on. And, there's the same sort of thing is perhaps going to happen with white-breasted nuthatches, and there's the fox sparrows, and there's a whole bunch of, I think most birders who have spent time kind of researching North American birds are aware of several cases that they're just waiting. The willets is another one, where they're just waiting for the AOU to ratify the split. But all the members of the split are recognized taxa. There's subspecies presently, but all it takes is removing that middle name, and they're going to be a species separate from one another. And so that's a slightly different scenario than a completely newly discovered taxon, which is a rare event, as you say.
And the one thing too that I think, I was chatting with George about this a few days ago, is that so we've been birding for a while, and birding has changed in all sorts of ways over the years. And one of the things that's happened, especially as more new people have come in on it, and there's no negative to this, it's just the way it is. But birding has it used to be really, really allied closely with science. Sort of ornithologists and birders were sort of like in this continuum of like the field birders were field ornithologists, and that everybody kind of knew how the science worked back in the day because it was sort of an integral part of the birding scene. And today you can become a birder, a brand new birder, and almost not actually have much contact to the scientific world of birds, the ornithological world. And I think it's an interesting situation that we're in. So, and also, for us, all three of us who've been around this for enough, we sometimes forget that people don't know how or why some of this stuff happens the way it happens. But one thing that it'd be cool if you could talk about, Dan, is how a name is associated with, like in a museum, how that name is kept and how that name actually has some real live tangible reality in the scientific world. And I'm talking about specimens, right?
Right.
How did you, sort of explain to people what that is and the system in a sense, kind of in a way that people can go, oh, okay, I kind of get it now, why this is.
Yeah, that's a great question. Science, of course, requires verifiable facts, if you will, and so when you're
so they say,
yeah, right. I mean, I guess there is some question on that these days, but when you're naming a new taxon of pretty much any kind of organism, and this is true from bacteria all the way up to whales. This is like any plants, mammals, insects, whatever you're talking about. That I think that most of these organisms, you need to have a certain number of pieces of information available, and when you name a taxon, there is almost always a need for what's called a type. It's that gold standard. So when you think about, for example, the metric system, in France, there's actually a spot where there are the official meter stick and the official kilo, weight, and so on. These standards that everything else could conceivably be measured against in order to be sure that your kilo is the same as the standardized kilo, right? So this is a similar idea. So in the world of birds, you have a museum skin that is going to be the representative for that name.
Grounds or anchors that individual species, right? It's like
that's right.
The thing that anchors it and tethers it to science.
Right. And so that name is forever attached to this single specimen, specimen that is stored in some place where people will have a chance to review it in the future, one hopes, if it doesn't get destroyed by a Second World War or something of that nature, which has happened. And so that specimen is the one to which the name is best attached to that particular individual.
Hey, Dan, some people might think, okay, well, at this point, the physical specimen, the skin in the museum, which often is associated with a recording, it's associated in these days with DNA and all this other stuff. Some people might say, hey, look, why not just grab some blood, little DNA or something from the bird, a feather, and that's it. What are the issues you see with that situation in terms of a type specimen being a vial of DNA? Let's simplifying it. Of course, it's not a vial of DNA you extract from it,
but the main issue is if you don't have a physical specimen available for people to review in the future, then there may be some real questions about what that holotype really was. I mean, just imagine most birds that are being described new to science these days, and for that matter, most that have been over the past 200 years, are not super distinct. They're often something that looks a lot like a related species. And there have been many cases where there has been confusion about what population is the correct population to apply a name to. It's really important to have the actual physical specimen to have phenotypic characters, meaning plumage characters, measurements that you can then compare other birds to.
I was going to say that the way that we interact with these birds, right, is that we see them and we hear them and so forth, but we actually see these things as a living, breathing bird with a certain kind of structure and coloration and so forth, and a feathered specimen kind of immediately gives us an idea of like, okay, this is what this thing looks like. You can then start measuring it and do all sorts of other things. But little vial of DNA, we can't interact with that in nature, in a sense. I
think a lot of folks struggle to understand. All of us have some, you guys have considerable museum background. I have a bit myself. As Al was alluding to earlier, I think early on, people really came at birding. Often they were encouraged by scientists or people that had some background in science, and now birding is so popular that people are finding it all sorts of different ways, often digital photography, if not other ways. And I think it's hard for some of those folks to understand not only the value of an individual specimen, but of a series of specimens like you're talking about, and just the information that you can get from one individual specimen. And especially if there are no other representatives of that species, or very few, every single specimen for a bird like that is intensely valuable to scientists. And maybe you could talk a little bit about that, both of you guys. And maybe I'll start with you, Al. If you're looking at a single, specimen, or even a couple specimens for something that's really scarce, what value do those specimens represent to not just scientists, but the general public's understanding of a species?
Well, they're really valuable, and in museums they're treated like they're an irreplaceable, artifact, like out of King Tut's tomb, let's put it. This is the level at which museum people treat these specimens. They're not throwaways. They're very and obviously there are types, and some specimens are much more valuable, and they're kept in separate places, and they're in fireproof type containers, let's call them. But I have looked at type specimens of various seabirds and some of the Chilean stuff I did, and also went, in New York to see some of these oddball seabirds that were collected in the 1800s or early 1900s, of these storm petrels that people haven't, sort of seen again, or, and they're starting to see them now in these expeditions and sorting out what they might be. Are they a different species or what? And you see this real thing and you're thinking, you go, oh my God, look at this. This looks like nothing else on earth right here. And you do get this sense of, wow, it might be one specimen or two collected during a period of time way back. And first of all, I marvel at the fact that people have kept these for so long, so that I can look at it, hundreds sometimes of years after
like Stevens Island wren and some of these things. It's like,
And then I have a direct connection to that actual observation. And then I can put it into context of what I know about these birds. And I was looking at these, the toes and some of these storm petrels kind of tell you who they're. I'm like, wow, this is something amazing. And sure enough, there's people now in the seabird world looking for these things and seeing these stripy storm petrels out in the middle of, the South Pacific that probably are a different, species that we don't know where they breed and this and that. And just giving you that example of how much you can get from a single bird that, in the past might have thought to be like just some oddball or, this or that or whatever. And now we know, oh, okay, no, this is actually super valuable. And just to let people know that these birds did, die for science in a sense, but they are cared for in a way that allows them to continue living in the scientific world for hundreds of years and inform us in a way that is really valuable. And, going into different museums, for example, Dan and I were talking about this funny oriole that showed up in my backyard. One of the things I need to do now is actually go to the museum and look at oriole specimens to sort out what actually is important. And I cannot do that just from random photographs,
Right.
I cannot do that.
You need to look at other actual birds, get them in your hands and look at them and look at
compare
the
them.
Take measurements and all that.
Line up 10 dull Baltimore Orioles, line up 10 Bulldogs Orioles. They could be from West Mexico from 50 years ago, 5 years ago, 100 years ago, and they're all still, I can look at that and go, okay, let's put some logic behind what I'm seeing here, and sort of with with a museum eye kind of pick out features that later we can actually use in the field. And most people who are using field guides and field marks and all this kind of stuff that seems to come out of nowhere, no, 99.9% of that came from somebody looking at specimens.
That's one of the things. And, I always like to say anyway, the conservation in science often begins with these specimens.
I think, we've kind of set up this idea of the museums and the specimens and how all this works and names. We should also say that in today's world, there's actually very, very little specimen collection.
Yeah, relative to decades past.
Decades past, when all, people always say, back in Audubon's time, all ornithology was done with a gun, and there's a truth to that, and it's totally shifted. But the one time where specimen collection happens invariably is when there's a new species involved. Yeah. And hey, talking about new species.
Yeah. Let's zoom out here. I'll redirect if need be, but I think we want to talk about this new tanager. Yeah.
I was working at the time for Wings Tours, and I was doing my very first tour to Manu, which is, George was saying that the Manu Road has been, I think it's been open since about the 1980s. And it's one of the few points in southeastern Peru where there's access to this broad elevation band of humid montane slopes and lowlands, which is a very complex ecosystem, as you can imagine. It's the edge of the Amazon, one of the most diverse plant animal communities in the world. And so that particular road has received a lot of attention over 30, 40 years now. It may be one of the best known localities in the Amazon of Peru, certainly, I would say.
Yeah. In terms of species diversity and legendary awesome birding, it's way up there.
It is, indeed. So here I am on the very first tour I ever did.
Polynesian, Manu means bird.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Nice interjection there. So I was on this road. I was co-leading this tour with Gary Rosenberg and Barry Walker, and we had a group of 15 clients or something, and we had just spent several nights in this place called Cock of the Rock Lodge, which is at this middle elevation area, which is approximately 1,400 to 1,500 meters in elevation. And it was our day that we were departing to go down slope to our next lodge, which is Amazonia Lodge, which is down on the Madre de Dios River. And so we departed the lodge, and we were walking through a section of road that had a lot of bamboo and second growth and what looked like a series of landslides, ancient landslides that had filled in bamboo and second growth. And that section of road is just high diversity. There's lots of really cool birds. And so we were just caught up in this mixed species flock of, tropical arboreal species. And we were pointing out, gray-mantled wren and yellow-rumped ant wren and all these tanagers and all these other things to the group. And in the background, I was hearing this bird song. And having never been to the area before, I just sort of was assuming what would be common locally, but not elsewhere, and what we could put off to look at. Because you've got so many birds, you can't really show everything to the clients at once because there's 150 birds around you kind of thing, and you can only show them 30 or 40, in a relatively small amount of time. So to my ear, that voice sounded like a bird that I figured would be pretty common lower down, called a masked yellowthroat. Fun fact, we never actually saw a masked yellowthroat on the tour, but at the time I wasn't aware that would be a problem. So that's sort of what it sounded like. It had a sort of a yellow throaty sound to it. So I was kind of ignoring that, and I was concentrating on the birds I knew we needed to get the group on at the spot. Well, after a little while, I saw a bird fly up and land on the very top of a dead tree, 20 or 30 feet off the ground, and it started giving this song. So right there, there was a warning bell that went off. So that's not a yellowthroat. They don't do that. So I looked at the bird through my binoculars, and it just didn't add up. And so I put it in my telescope, and I looked through the scope, and this thing was, about the size and shape of like a scarlet tanager, a piranga tanager. But it was bright canary yellow, and it had a black eyebrow, and it had a pink bill. That was basically all I could see. I didn't see any other markings. And this thing, at that point, I had, I'd been at LSU since 1995. I'd really been putting in time trying to learn, because there's no field guide to Peru at that point. There was a couple of books to like birds of South America, but they were far from complete in their illustrations and so on. So I had really put in the work to try to learn what I could from our collection at LSU as far as informing myself on what birds would be expected and what they looked like. And this thing just wasn't hitting anything. It just, nothing.
Right. And on top of that, it's a brilliant looking bird, right? It's like, not only do you not recognize it, but it's amazing looking, right?
Well, the first thing that popped into my head actually was one of these African or Asian Orioles, one of these old world orioles that have a black stripe over the eye and a pink bill and yellow plumage and so on. So anyway, in the space of about 2 seconds, I'd seen this thing. I'd gone, holy crap, I don't know what this is. And I turned to Gary Rosenberg and said, Gary, take a look at my scope and tell me what you see. And he looks in there, and he sort of took his eye off it, and he had this bulging-eyed, mouth agape look, and he's like,
like, what the deuce?
Yeah, he's like, the only thing that's coming to mind is one of these African or Asian Orioles. And I was like, that's exactly what I was thinking. And so we turned to Barry Walker, who is a British expat who's been living in Peru since the 80s. And he's like the local Peruvian, birding expert and so on. And he knew that road cold.
Legend.
And so we said, Barry, take a look in here and tell me what this is. And Barry looked in the scope, and he turned to us and he says, all I'm seeing is a bouncing branch. And the bird had just left the second before he looked at the scope and flown over the ridge and disappeared. And Gary, thankfully, got about a 5 or 6 second recording of the last couple of songs it gave before it departed. And so we had that. And I made a sketch of it immediately in my sketchbook just to try to get all the information I could remember into, some format. And so that's all we had as far as documentation. No other members of the group saw the bird, just Gary and me, which kind of stings now. And so we were just staring at each other and going, well, what did we just see? We have no idea what we just saw. And
right. These are three guys that know these birds back and forth, and you're looking at something, and none of you have any idea what it is. Right,
and that in itself is usually like an indication that something really interesting is going on.
That's a red flag.
Yeah. When I got back to Louisiana, I made, I don't remember if we had any way of scanning and sending emails, but I made photocopies of this thing and I sent it to, the Eislers who wrote the Tanager book, and to Tom Schulenberg, and to, Brett Whitney and the folks at LSU, and I was trying to get anyone's opinion of what this might be. And they all, basically their response in every case was, are you sure this is what you saw? And so it was this sort of thing where, I wasn't really sure, honestly. I thought that's what I saw. And Gary,
did you start to question yourself? Did you start to have some doubts?
The following year, we did the tour. We basically were doing this tour every year at the same time in October. And the following year, we went back down there and did the tour. And at that stretch in the road, I put in, Carrie had given me a copy of his recording. So I was just playing that recording, just hoping this thing would sort of respond. And there was no response. And I seem to think I went back on my own after that tour to really put in the work and see if I could locate this thing. And I spent like 3 or 4 days just walking up and down, several kilometers of that road with that playback, and nothing. There was nothing responding. And so after a while, I started actually questioning whether we had the sun in our eyes or something. Like one of the other things I was thinking was, well, another bird that this sounds a bit like is this vireo called the brown-capped vireo, which is very similar to our warbling vireo here in North America, especially the western ones in voice. And it sort of sounds a bit like that. And, there is this phenomenon where a bird's plumage can lose melanins but retain, the yellow pigments. And I was thinking, I wonder if this could be like a vireo that just has this bizarre plumage issue, and it's yellow with only a bit of melanin retained around its face. And, we just saw this thing, and it looked really weird, but it's just a vireo kind of thing. So, it was, until 2000 was that first observation. And then 2003, now, this is 3 years later, I fully am questioning my sanity on this observation. We were doing the tour once again. Gary and me were co-leading, and we turned that same corner, and I heard that bird singing off in the distance. And I turned to Gary and I'm like, Gary, that's our bird. And so we walked closer, and this thing was kind of down inside bamboo, low to the ground, singing on its own. And so I got a recording of it, and I played it back, and the thing popped right up on top of a tree in response. And everybody in our group got great views of it. And Gary was, after everyone had looked through the telescope, at that time, most of our bird photography was digiscoping. So Gary was struggling to get to the scope and get the camera set up on the thing to get a photograph of it, and it flew.
He's like elbowing people. He's like, out of the way, everybody.
Well, I mean, like we had to make sure everyone had a chance to see it. And by the time the last person was satisfied and Gary was putting his camera to the scope lens, the bird flew off. And the same thing happened. Basically, we played back to it, and it just wouldn't come back in. But we now had, we had a much longer, better view of this thing, exactly the same canary yellow, black eyebrow, pink bill.
Right. And you're like, we're not crazy.
And we said, this is a real bird. This thing is real. And so that really, helped a lot.
I think a lot of people probably have never had this thought even that we put things into a box, right? Into an identification, into something based on what we know, what we see in a book, and something that's not identified. It's going to be somewhere else, or it's a vagrant, or there's a box for it somewhere. But when there is no box, because it doesn't actually exist, right? There is no name. We're not set up for that as humans. Like, we kind of aren't. And you're automatically going to question what you saw, because how can you see what isn't really there?
It doesn't exist yet.
It doesn't exist in the scientific sense, in the fact that you've seen an image of it before or anything. It's just sort of brand new. You can't. We're not really sort of set up for that. We're humans are all kind of we're set up to know. Okay, that's a carrot. That's an orange. That's an apple. Not. Yeah. Whoa.
Well, it's true.
I can totally understand your idea there for, second guessing.
Well, especially since we didn't actually have tangible evidence to support it, besides this little
photo, a snippet of a recording.
Nothing, what I would call objective evidence that isn't affected by our experience, which I'd call subjective evidence. Like a sketch is kind of subjective. Yeah, we didn't have anything to really support us in what we thought we saw, except our own belief that in fact was what we saw. And as you say, that I think we're generally programmed to have these search images. And if something doesn't fit a search image, well, that must be because we didn't see it as well as we thought, kind of thing. And more often than not, that's true. That's the way it works, right? That's how UFOs and all these things happen. Is people are they're not familiar enough with all the potential things that can look like what they just saw, and so they jump to the conclusion, well, it must be an alien or whatever. So I mean, I think that's true.
Now we're going to get hate mail from the UFO people.
I was going to say, yeah.
or ivory-billed woodpeckers.
Evidently, Dan is skeptical of the aliens I've been seeing in my backyard. That's
apparently,
fine.
Obama says they're real.
And so in 2004, Field Museum had asked me if I would join an expedition they were doing. So we were already in Cusco. And so I was thinking, well, we're here, and I've got all the permits necessary to make a collection of this thing. And we talked to the folks who were stewards of the properties on the Manu Road again. And I talked to Barry Walker, who had a vehicle. And so I arranged to go back down to this locality on the Manu Road with the aim to get the specimen finally. And so it was in early June that we went back down in there. It was Barry and a friend of his, Hugh Lloyd, who was a leader for Barry's company, and then Abram Urbai, who was a fellow who'd been a field assistant of LSU for many, many years, and me, the four of us. We drove down, we spent the night at the Cock of the Rock Lodge again, and then we returned to that same corner, which is now, I guess, mostly known as Tanager Corner. And I gave Barry and Hugh playback of this thing, and we kind of went 3 different directions, hoping to find it. Meanwhile, Abram was setting up mist nets, and maybe he would just net it without us detecting it first. And we just walked in 3 different directions, and within 15 minutes, Barry says, "I've got the bird." And so we all ran up to where he was, and sure enough, here's this thing sitting up in the tree, singing away, So again, get recordings of it. We were watching this thing. It was foraging, same plumage, yellow with black eyebrow, pink bill. And, so we gave it like an hour and a half or something like that. And, I finally was like, guys, this is the thing. This is maybe the one time that this can happen. I've got to collect this bird. And I had a shotgun, and this was really, the bird was in the canopy. And so it wouldn't be possible to net it anyway. And so I collected the bird. And man, picking it up from the ground, my hands were shaking because, finally having it in the hand, having tangible evidence of the existence of this thing, and actually being able to see it up close and to see the feather tracts and the colors and so on. It was absolutely incredible. Like I'd sensed that once before with that barbet years earlier, but here it was again, this brand new thing that was unknown to science. And it's just this kind of amazing feeling.
Okay, so you got the bird in your hand, and it's been like from when. Remind us of how much time elapsed from your first sighting to actually holding this bird in your hand finally.
Yeah, so it's been basically from the very first sighting until the moment where I finally was able to hold this bird in the hand. It was 3.5 years, and as you can imagine, I was like, wow, this is it. I finally will be able to settle all the questions in my head and start writing this thing up and get this published in a few months. And I was, unknown to me, there was a couple of bumps in that road. So in 2004, this bird could have been described in 2004 or 5, but there were some delays. And so the first delay happened that very night.
Ouch.
Which was, so I prepared this specimen as a museum skin, and I, saved tissues and all this other stuff. And when you prepare a specimen, it has to dry in its position in a relatively stable place. It can't be jostled around and so on. So what we often do is we'll wrap it in cotton and we'll pin that down onto a styrofoam board and let that dry for overnight or maybe a couple days to let it set as it is. And that way it'll be the sort of stiff specimen that you see in a museum. And that day we'd also gone down the road and found a couple other things of interest that we'd collected. So this wasn't the only specimen I had that day. And so I prepared the specimens and put them on a card or a piece of styrofoam. And as I would normally do, I stuck it kind of in the rafters over the bed in the bedroom at this lodge, without really thinking about the potential.
Like up in the you stick it up like kind of in the ceiling, like towards the ceiling.
Yeah, so like the ceiling is this is a tropical lodge, so the ceiling is very high above the top of the walls. There's actually air flow to let it cool off because it can get quite warm. So there's these sort of cross beams that are within about 6 feet or 7 feet of the ground, and so I stuck the board up there to dry. And I went to dinner. And, about an hour and a half later, I came back into the room and the board was on the floor. And there were a couple of piles of feathers and some, cotton was kind of strewn across the floor. And I just had a heart attack. I was staring at this and I was thinking, oh my God, there's one specimen of this thing in the world and it looks like it's just been eaten by an animal that got into the room while I was away. And, in retrospect, I actually had been at this lodge previously and seen a mouse opossum walking on those very rafters over the rooms. And I don't know why that didn't occur. It's like, you might want to find a more secure place to store this specimen because there are.
So you think a mouse opossum just kind of like ran in on one of the rafters and chowed down on this thing?
It was either a mouse opossum or some kind of rat, is my guess. Got in, found these specimens and started chewing. And kind of luckily, the bird that was most destroyed was a little flycatcher that was one of the other specimens on the board. And that was the only specimen that was completely destroyed. Then there was another flycatcher and this tanager, where this animal very nicely removed the legs and apparently must have eaten them, because I guess there may have been still some flesh on them or something, but left the rest of the bird intact. But the tags, which are normally tied onto the legs, were very neatly placed beside the specimen on the floor. So the tag was there, most of the bird was there, but the legs were missing. And, it could have been a lot worse, obviously, but it just hit me, in the heart that this incredibly unique specimen suddenly is no longer whole.
So it's been 3+ years. You finally have the thing in your hand, and 8 hours later or less, it's been mostly destroyed.
Yeah. Well, not mostly destroyed, but it was definitely it had less to it than I had hoped.
Less valuable than it was. Yeah.
So I tied the tag back into what was the main body of the specimen, and I set it back. This time I put it in a trunk, closed the lid, locked it, made sure that nothing could get in. And, it dried, but, I was hoping that over the next couple of days that maybe we'd be able to find some more and I might be able to get one more specimen. And because, as you were saying earlier, series have a lot of value, series of specimens, because of being able to see variation and so on. I was hoping maybe we could find another one, but we were not able to. That was the only one we were able to find on that visit. But I should reiterate, this is a single road that passes through a huge area of basically inaccessible habitat. And to imagine, I know there's some folks out there who have asked me in the past, like, how do you know this isn't the only one? Well, the odds of a single individual, the last remaining individual of a species, being on a road that is the only access to this huge area of habitat are mighty small. So that's where that lay for quite some time. And the next event happened in 2011, so many years later. That was 2004 that we got this first specimen. 2011, a colleague named Frank Reindt, who was a German who had gone to grad school in Australia, studying Elanias, actually, and a couple other South American flycatchers, the Zimerius. And then he did a postdoc at Harvard University, and that's where he was at the time. And he'd been doing field work in Bolivia, specifically related to studying Elanias. And so he had gone down into a valley in La Paz department, sort of western Bolivia near the Peruvian border, and had been sort of birding and looking for his Elanias in this open country habitat around the town of Apollo, kind of like the Greek god Apollo. Right? And he went down a valley that went down below a large plateau where the town of Apollo is. And he was there in November and December. Now, this valley, it turns out, is highly seasonal and deciduous in nature. The trees are largely deciduous. And most of the studies that had happened in this valley had taken place between March and August, I think, or September, which is the dry season in the area. It's easier to get in there in the dry season, but it's basically their winter. So a lot of birds are not in their breeding condition. And, apparently one of the things that had been overlooked is this bird. So Frank was in this valley and he heard this bird song. He eventually got a recording of it and he played the bird in and saw it and recognized it to be this new tanager. And so the next time he was able to get in contact with me by email, when he got back to the city of La Paz, he sent me an email and said, Dan, I think I found your tanager from the Manu Road in Bolivia. And the thing is, it's really common here. It's everywhere. They're all over this valley and they're singing up a storm. And he right there, he was like, I think what's going on is this bird is migratory, that it doesn't exist in this valley in the non-breeding season. It goes to possibly to Manu and winters there. And it's not present in Manu during the wet season when it's in this valley breeding. And, it just sort of all made sense. The moment he brought that up, it was like, of course, that explains everything. Because every time I followed up, we'd had the bird on the tour in October, and then I'd go back in November to see if I could find it again. And I couldn't. Well, November is the rainy season in this valley. The birds would have migrated out. And then, the people who were going to this valley doing surveys were going there in June, July, August, and they were missing this bird because it's not present there. And so it just kind of made a lot of sense. So
like ships passing in the night, basically, for years.
Yeah, it was just this sort of, it's a rare event, but there are quite a few, mostly flycatchers in the tropics that are intratropical migrants. If you listen to last week's show, you'll hear about Williams that do this. And but it's not common with tanagers. There's actually, most of the tanagers that do this are seed eaters, which of course were not recognized as tanagers until recently. And they're mostly nomadic. There are a couple that are truly migratory, but many of them are nomadic, and they, grasslands are ephemeral things. And so they track grasslands, or seeding bamboo, which is also very cyclical and ephemeral. So these are birds that are generally nomadic. So there's relatively few tropical passerines that are migratory that remain within the tropics. And another one of note is this bird called the black and white tanager that breeds mostly in northwestern Peru and southwestern Ecuador, again, in deciduous forests. And then it actually crosses the Andes and it winters on the Amazonian slope of the Andes and down into the Guadua bamboo lowlands of southeastern Peru and adjacent Bolivia and Brazil. And it actually turns out that these two tanagers, this undescribed one and the black and white tanager, have, to me, it seems like a lot in common, that their migratory habits seem to be very similar to one another. So there's a precedence that was set by the black and white tanager that this new bird seems to fit, even though it turns out later on we discovered they're not that closely related to each other, but they seem to have similar migratory systems. So that was kind of this incredible revelation, I think, that really
made all the pieces fit.
Yeah, it all kind of made sense. So we LSU arranged to go down and revisit this valley. This fellow Frank joined us. There was a LSU student that joined us, and then another friend, a fellow named Jonathan Schmidt, who was a grad student at the University of New Mexico at the time, joined us as well. And we had a friend, a driver that I usually have on the tours that I do in Bolivia, joined us, and he drove us out to this place. We drove from Santa Cruz City all the way out to La Paz and then down into this valley. It's like a 3-day drive to get there. Through like every possible habitat you can hit in Bolivia, which is a lot, as you guys know, because you've both been there. And so it was quite an epic drive to get out there. But we got down to this valley and we set up a camp up on a side road. And after a morning of birding there, we discovered, this thing is all over the place. Wow. You could hear the song echoing across the valley.
What was that moment like? Like the first time you got out and you're hearing multiple individuals singing.
Well,
that must have been
it took a little while
epic
to detect the first one. So we arrived there in the afternoon, set up camp, spent the night, and the next morning, then we all went separate directions. And so I was hiking on this trail, and I started hearing one singing up on the slope above me, and I was like, "That's the bird. There it is." So I hiked up the slope, bushwhacking up through this dense understory. And I got up onto the side of the ridge and got kind of underneath the bird, got some recordings of it, played it back and watched it overhead. It was in this tree overhead and so on. And it was like seeing an old friend that I hadn't had contact with for a long time. It was this great feeling, And so again, we had to collect a couple of specimens because we needed tissues to do this genetic study and so on. So I collected the bird and spent the morning walking along. I think I heard a couple more. And then I got back down to camp for lunch. And the other guys had come in, and they all were kind of glum and empty-handed. And I pulled the bird out and put it on the table. And everyone was like, bleepity bleep, I can't believe it. So then, once we'd gotten an idea of where to look and so on, there's the train that is right behind my house, by the way.
Wow. I forgot about that train at your house. Yeah. Forgot about that. Is that bringing the Boudin?
No, it's not. That's, I guess, heading to Chicago.
I hear a rail.
Yeah, there you go.
A single rail.
Yeah.
All right.
Actually,
so
I like that. People really realize this is actually real.
Yeah, that's ambiance.
This is alive. This is not scripted. I'm sure.
I wish we had some video though showing like your whole place like wobbling around. Yeah,
exactly.
Totally not going to cut that.
So yeah, over the next couple of days, we discovered that this bird was actually abundant in this valley. I mean, I think we encountered something like 20 singing males in about 3 square kilometers, something like that. It was some crazy number. But the funny thing was, we did not find a female. All we were encountering were singing males. And again, so this sort of, to come up with a just so story, we were guessing that what's going on is these birds had probably just arrived from where they'd been spending the non-breeding season. And these were males that were just trying to set up their territories, attract mates. And that was either the females hadn't arrived yet, or the females had arrived and were already sitting on nests.
Did you ever think that maybe they just looked the same and both sang? Or
well, we did, because at that point, that all we were familiar with was the male plumage. That's the only thing that I had seen at that point. We spent I think about a week in this place, and it wasn't until the day we were departing that we saw 2 females, and they actually differed considerably. They don't. Well, one thing I didn't say is that. So on top of the description I'd already been giving you, this canary yellow bird with a black eyebrow and pink bill, it also has a bushy crest that's kind of like, I don't know if we really have. It's less developed than a tufted titmouse. It's not pointed. It's
like a great crested flycatcher or something?
Yeah, I guess that might be a reasonable comparison.
Yeah.
But it's bright kind of saffron orange. It's a really like a nice colorful, it's a little bit more orange than the rest of the bird's plumage. So it's a really attractive adornment, if you will. But the female lacks the eyebrow and lacks the crest. And she has a pink bill, or patchy pink and blackish bill. And we saw 2 of them. We got 1 specimen of that plumage. And the bird we collected actually had an egg in the oviduct. So these were females in the act of laying eggs. So that, in retrospect, probably explained why we couldn't find other females, because they were all sitting on eggs on their nests. And the only way we were finding males is because they were singing, really. So it really seems like this bird keeps a super low profile if it's not singing, because it's so hard to find them. And the habitat in this valley, it's deciduous forest, but there is a component in the understory of guadua bamboo or bamboo-like grasses that seems to be pretty common through most of the places where we were finding territories of this bird. So I still have the gut feeling, although, I think it's still not quite certain yet, but my gut feeling is this bird is tied in some respect to bamboo structure of some kind as its microhabitat of choice, which seems to hold both where we found it in the Manu Road and now this valley. And it's really impenetrable habitat. If you try to get into it, this bamboo is just dense and it's thorny and it's difficult to get into. And so it's hard to kind of go bashing around the understory looking for nests and so on. Although I hope at some point somebody will do that and we'll find some, because it'd be really interesting to know more about that aspect of its life cycle. But so here we have a huge part of the story. And this was really the thing that we had been waiting for. So this was in 2012. We'd gotten some more specimens. We finally had tissues. We had this incredible new aspect of this bird's story, that it's an intratropical migrant. It breeds in deciduous forest and winters, a couple 100 miles away in the foothills of the Andes. And then there was another one of these incredible unforeseen events. Basically, we were working with a museum that's based in Santa Cruz, Bolivia, and there was an issue with the bureaucracy of that museum and some of the politics in Bolivia that basically made it, we were told by the people of the museum, you can't publish anything referencing these specimens. And so after having waited all these years, having to have suffered this bird losing its legs and all that business, once again, being so close to finally having everything in place to publish this new bird and have it all taken away from us again was absolutely infuriating.
Devastating.
It was so incredibly difficult to just feel like, you know what, I'm just going to publish this. Who cares about, the politics in Bolivia kind of thing. But of course, were that to happen, they would probably never want to work with us again. And, there's so much more to do in Bolivia. And that would just not be cool.
Right. And so meanwhile, you're like this now, like there's some word out about this thing, right? There's some,
that's right.
There's people that know about this bird. They're like, because you guys in the process of trying to figure out where the heck it was, you kind of had circulated some of the description, right? And there's word, people were seeing it, around, and here you've spent close to a decade trying to track this down since discovery, and the last thing you need is some wackadoo publish some paper and describe it right out from under you, right? That was a concern as this was going on. Yeah,
that's definitely true, and you want to make sure that folks are aware that it exists, and that you kind of have your it sounds a little bit silly, but you kind of have your name attached to it to know that there is somebody working on this bird kind of thing. But you don't want to release too much information to then just sort of
a little bit of a delicate balance.
To put out a roadmap that someone could just follow and like you say, basically kind of scoop you on the description aspect of it.
And in the meantime, too, one of the things that's going on is that through Frank's work and this tanager, people are finding out that this valley in Apollo in Bolivia is really important. Like, it's a conservation issue, and it's just sort of sitting there. Some of the information that would make it kind of really sort of
significant,
clearly valuable and significant is not allowed to happen. It's kind of infuriating in that respect too, from the conservation viewpoint of like, wow,
Yes and no. I mean, the valley is actually kind of below the town of Apollo, and it's right on the border of Madidi National Park, which is one of the largest national parks in Bolivia, and it's largely inaccessible. Where we were was outside the park along a road that leads down to some, I don't remember what the name of the town at the end of it was. And so that road goes through, there's little villages and so on along there, but most of the forest along the road is still in pretty good shape. But, that was now over 10 years ago. And it turns out that there are international interests that are actually trying to punch that road through to I think it may even be that they want it to go through a corner of Madidi National Park now, but it's going to be extended to meet up with the city of Rurrenabaque, which is way out in the Amazonian lowlands, farther out there. And of course, the moment you put in a high quality road that connects two major cities, you're going to have colonists coming in and just,
open festering wound in the forest
and cutting forest and putting in their little, what we call chakras, their little farm plots, and having animals they have to cut down forest to put pasture and all this other stuff. So yeah, the conservation concern along the road immediately is. So I sent the tissues to this fellow, Kevin Burns, who has been studying the tanagers. He's the guy actually responsible for shuffling around tanagers and, putting the Piranga tanagers in the cardinals and bringing.
He's the guy.
He's the guy. He's Mr. Tanager. So we sent the tissues to him for him to figure out what this bird is related to. It turns out, indeed, it is a tanager, a true tanager, and it's related to two distinctive species that are each in their own genus. One is called the gray-headed tanager, which is found from Mexico to Argentina, and The other one is called the black goggled, has this cool English name, the black goggled tanager, which is found in the southern Andes and in the coast of Brazil in the Atlantic forest. And the two birds are not really very similar to one another at all. As far as I know, neither of them has any known migratory aspects to their life cycle. The gray-headed tanager does not have distinctive male and female plumages. The black goggled tanager does. They both have a bit of a bushy crest, so that is kind of similar to this new bird. But they're not really. You look at them, and they don't really look much like this bird at all. So, and then if you look at the trees, the three species are closely related, but the new tanager, it wasn't always clear which of the two others it was most closely related to. And it's what are called long branches, meaning these things have been separated for millions of years from one another. So we decided that the best course of action was to give this its own genus, which is what we did.
I was going to say that when I first saw images of this tanager before it was published, that there were images out there, without a name, even on eBird. I, in my head, made it, partially because of the long shape and so forth, into a group that's mostly black with crown stripes, a tachyphonus.
That's right. Yeah.
That's what I thought. It's probably one of those, except it's not black, it's yellow. And it's got that little bushy crest and little stripe. And it's amazing that when I read the paper, I was like, what? I was like, it's not one of those.
You're actually kind of right. This tanager falls into that group, right? So the tachyphonus, in fact, it has to be broken into several genera because they're not closest relatives to one another. There's a couple of other species of tanagers interjected in between. It's no longer monophyletic, using the jargon of phylogenetics. So you're right in that it does fall into that group of tanagers, but in that group are gray-headed and black-goggled tanagers. And so this is part of that. Your intuition is accurate.
Not bad, Alvaro.
It is part of that
bad.
group.
Armchair
I was
taxonomy.
I was off by a few million years.
That's right. But that's pretty good. It is related to that group generally, but its closest relatives are these two other tanagers. And so because of these aspects that, it doesn't particularly look or sound like either of those two tanagers, and its relationship to them it's not clear which one is the closest relative. We just figured that having a new genus is the way to go. And, from the moment that I first, was sure that this thing was real back in 2003 when we saw it, I was thinking, this is going to be a new genus. Whatever this thing is, it's going to be a new genus. So it was kind of cool that really was kind of the best course to take. And so then, one of the things obviously to then come up with is, what are you going to call it? And, originally with this one specimen that was lacking its legs, I was tempted to name this thing Apodothrapus, which means, tanager with no legs.
Right.
You've always been good with the names, Dan. Always good with the names.
The swifts, of course, are in family Apodidae. There's the type genus is Apus, which means no feet, because folks in Europe didn't think swifts had feet. So that's where Apodothrapus means.
Yeah, it's sort of like the beardless triangulate being imberbe, which means without a beard.
That's right.
I love that. It's like, so if somebody ever shaves, a friend of yours, has a beard, shaves, you're going imberbe.
Yes.
That's right. So that was one thing I was considering. And then, I was also considering naming this thing the El Dorado tanager, because it was in many, Dorado is Spanish for golden, and it was golden in color. But at the same time, this was like the myth of El Dorado, this golden treasure that people searched for could never find. Like, this bird kept getting snatched away out of my fingers so many times that it just felt like that. It was incredibly frustrating. The history of this bird, I would definitely say, caused me an inordinate amount of stress and frustration.
Well, it only took almost 20 years, right? So was it?
It only took over 20 years. Yeah. And it almost is to the point now where it seeing the bird kind of makes me feel bad. You would think that this cool bird, this discovery would be reason just to feel, excitement and elation about having been associated with this thing. And in some ways, that has been overcome by the history of this thing. It's
gotten kind of loaded.
Cringe. Yeah, it just makes me cringe when I think about all the things that happened that just were so frustrating. But in the end, luckily, it all worked out.
I bet you can turn this around over the years, because this is actually one of the most unique, fantastic looking birds to have been described anywhere on Earth in our lifetimes. And one day you're going to wake up, Dan, and go, "Wow, I actually did have a part of this." And the more difficult parts will blend in towards the back, I think, of your mind.
Well, I don't know. It's one of those things where it's like a puppy dog that was beaten as a puppy, and it grows up and it's always a little fearful of when you roll up a newspaper or something. But I kind of have that continuing. I think there's always going to be a little bit of
get triggered by your own tanager.
Yeah. The tanager will always give me a little bit of a wince every time I think about it. But I have to admit that there's not a lot of folks who have had the opportunity to be involved in discovering new birds, much less several. I realize that I've been exceptionally lucky in that respect. And on top of that, relatively few of those discoveries have been so distinctive that they're kind of slapping your face new.
Right.
It's a very rare thing indeed to actually run into something that's so new that the moment you see it in the field, it's new. And so, I guess I haven't really appreciated this until fairly recently, that I have been very lucky to have been in the right place at the right time to be involved in multiple cases of this. And, that is something that the 12-year-old me looking at that Audubon magazine and thinking, wow, people still find new birds.
Yeah. Think about you calling up Van Remsen that time. You probably didn't foresee it working out quite this way.
No, I definitely did not. Yeah. So that really, I think the 12-year-old me would be pretty happy about that sort of result. But I should say, so the bird's name, the name we finally came up with for this thing, is Heliothraupas o'neilli. So Heliothraupas is Greek for tanager of the sun. Sun referring mostly to this. It's tropical. It's in kind of a sunny environment, and it's bright yellow. So sun just seems to it makes sense. So Heliothraupas is tanager of the sun. And then O'Neilly refers to John O'Neill, who, again, was a hero of mine since I was 12 when I first found out about his field work. And John, I was incredibly lucky. When I came to LSU, John and I became really good friends. And he has been a mentor of mine for most of my career. And, his wife says that he sort of considers me the son he never had, which is kind of a huge honor. And so this is something that I felt, John has earned. He's the guy who's discovered all these incredible new species, including his very first one was a new genus of tanager, Wentworthraupus, the orange-throated tanager, which was the bird that blew the doors off of South America in the 1960s and made people realize that, in fact, there are still a lot of new birds yet to be discovered down there. And so it just seemed kind of appropriate. John now is, his neotropical ornithological days probably have winded down.
Few have made anywhere close to the impact of John.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. And so it just felt like it was a very fitting homage to a great man to have his career begin with a spectacular new genus of tanager. And, one could say it's ending with a spectacular new genus of tanager named for him.
So,
and, that's something that I'm really proud to be able to do.
And the word Inti.
Yeah, so the common name, the English name that we've chosen for this bird, a couple of nicknames have been created over the years. My own nickname since the beginning was the Manu Mystery Yellowbird, which I guess is not really a very good one.
That's not your finest work, Dan. You've done way better than that elsewhere.
But Gary Rosenberg had a client who had gotten wind of this, and he came up with the name Kill Bill Tanager because of the bird's color pattern, the black and the yellow.
Right, like Uma Thurman in Kill Bill when she's wearing the yellow jumpsuit with the mask and all. Yeah.
So that name has, I think, been picked up in a lot of folks. And
a lot of people were calling it that for a long time.
But our final decision was to call it the Inti Tanager, and Inti, sort of in the same vein as Helio and Heliothropus, refers to the sun. It's the Quechua word for sun, and it was also a god to Inca. The Inti was one of the most important sort of supernatural characters in their world, basically. So it just kind of felt like that would be a nice name to give this bird. And so far, it sounds like it's gotten pretty positive reaction from all involved. So that's the bird's final name. It's Heliothropus o'neilli, the Inti Tanager.
Wow. Hell of a bird, man. Hell of a bird, hell of a story. And 2 decades in the making to finally bring it off. Was it just 2 weeks ago now that the description was formally published, and it must have been a monkey off your back. Exactly. A lot of folks have been waiting on it a long time. Those of us that know you, know Gary, know the others involved in the story. Just it really is. I it's the road to El Dorado. I swear, it's just like long journey. So anyway, congratulations
and
thanks
and turns
for
and a lot of frustrating dead ends too. Yeah.
Well, that's what makes it a great story, I think, too.
That's kind of the thing that's so amazing about this. Like this is, to me, one of the most exciting aspects of this kind of ornithology. Is it's still an aspect of what we sort of think of as a past age of discovery and exploration that's still going on today, and with modern technology at our side that allows us to actually make recordings of sounds and take genetic samples and do things that people 150, 200 years ago had no concept of how to do it, and the kind of information that we can gather and assimilate is amazing now. And these are kind of the last frontiers of ornithology, as far as just discovering what's there. I mean, that age of exploration hasn't ended yet. The stuff that Darwin and Wallace were doing. And now the amazing thing is that there's young folks in the countries themselves who have the interest and the opportunity to participate in this as well. And so that is really exciting to me, to see Peruvians getting excited about this and participating in this, and having a chance to have their stamp on some of these discoveries as well.
Yeah, I think we are really in the golden age of birding and ornithology, and it sort of seems to be like each year, like we've talked about that before, it seems like we're further in the golden age, that a lot of the technology is really helping understand. We have more people watching, we have people locally that are getting involved, and we have more people interested in the conservation. It's just, I just wish it would have happened earlier, for us, so that we could have been ahead of the curve in terms of some of the conservation issues. But we're getting to the point where we're almost at the sort of pivotal point where more people in the world are going to care about this than people that don't care about this. So, and I thank you, Dan, for the work you've done to, not only educate people about this, but to describe these birds, to bring them to focus and help in the most vital stage of conserving, is to actually know that these things exist and to tell us a story. It's been amazing, I think.
Well,
just to hear
sort of
from the person who did it.
To tie this back into the way this conversation started, you guys are doing, I think, as much of a important task in this as I am, because you're the folks who are the mouthpiece to the birding public, who are informing them on these kinds of scientific studies. And communication is so important to educate and to inform folks who might not otherwise be aware of the science that goes on behind the scenes, as it were. So thanks to you guys for the service of communicating to the public.
Yeah, man. We just like BSing about birds, really.
Well, who doesn't?
Yeah,
that's what we're all here for.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, Thanks so much, Dan. This has been it's been epic. We're looking forward to sharing this story with everybody. Thanks, everybody. And we will be back with more soon here at Lifelist.